literature, and all things bookish. Good morning. Today I'm going to do a little bit of a reset for my channel. I'm going to answer some author newbie book tag questions. I have a light work day today, so we're going to have a nice little cozy project day together, which is going to be a lot of fun. So right now it is late August, technically still summer, but I can taste fall in the air, and by the time you see this, it will be fall. We might do a little bit of fall-y things, some baking. I'm having a nice chai right now, although I've been drinking chais all summer long. It has not been a fall thing for me this year. So jumping into our first question. So the first question is, how did you discover AuthorTube? So I discovered AuthorTube through Jenna Morassi. I was working on a story and I was killing a lot of characters. So I wanted to come up with fresh ways to keep the death scenes interesting and dramatic. But I was working, so I couldn't read articles. So I was like, well, I'll see if YouTube has any information. And I put in the YouTube search, how to keep your death scenes fresh or something like that. And her video wasn't on that. It was on something else involving character deaths. But it introduced me to a whole new world. And from there, I discovered other authors like Cam Rice. I really loved that it was a way to connect with other indie writers and find out about what other indie writers were writing. Because it can be hard to find works by indie writers and get information on them and know how to vet them out and everything. And also just seeing other people share their journeys is really inspiring. And we'll do one more question before we move on to the day. I feel kind of cool waving this pen around like that. So we'll do one more question before we move on to getting into the activities for today. What genre do you write in? So I published 3 books before I realized I was writing Gothic novels. I grew up reading a lot of classics, a lot of fairy tales, and a lot of fantasy. And so all of those kind of came together when I started publishing and writing my own stories. And they all kind of had more of that heavy, dramatic vibe. They're all, at this point in time, based off of folklore and fairy tales. So at first, that's what I would just say. I write fairy tale and folklore retellings. But it was at the end of the 3rd book, after I published it, that I was like, these are all Gothic. They all kind of have a dark, dramatic adventure vibe. Those are the kinds of books I love. That really is it makes sense that that's what I would start writing. So I'm gonna finish my chai. I am going to do a 5-minute journal prompt that I like to do for my mornings. And then I'm going to make some zucchini bread, which feels like the perfect August thing to make because technically zucchini, it's still a summer food, right? But it's baking, so it's like fall. So that turned out to be more adventurous than I was expecting. The recipe I used called for egg substitute, but I didn't have egg substitute, so I substituted egg substitute with real eggs, but I didn't know how many to do, and I used 2, which turns out may have been too many because the batter ended up being quite watery. And then also we were out of baking soda, so I put extra baking powder, which really isn't equivalent, so I don't know why I did that, but it might be very, very fluffy. And I grated the zucchini long ways because I thought that would be faster to grate it, which it was, but it meant that it was really stringy and hard to get into the little muffin cups. So that was a little bit of a mess, but hopefully it will at least taste good. These are going to be my breakfast for the next week or 2. But while I'm waiting for them to bake, we're going to go ahead and answer a couple more of our AuthorTube newbie questions. What is your preferred writing tense, point of view, and category of story? I'm not sure what category of story means in this context. Maybe it means genre. I don't know if I have a preferred writing tense. I mean, past tense. I'm not using present tense in any of my stories. It can be done well, but it's challenging, and I usually find it distracting in most books. Like, point of view, I use both. I say both. I never use second person. I don't think very many authors do, but again, it can be done. But I generally use first person or third close. So it's more or less the same as first person, but you just say the name instead of saying I. Those are generally what I use. I don't use a lot of omniscient. But the thing about using third is you can go back and forth. Like, not, you don't want to be too abrupt, but if you think of it like a camera, you can back out and you can back in. And sometimes people will steer to like, okay, now we're going to follow a different person. My last couple of books have all been first person, but I use both. Category of story, I don't know what that means because we've already talked about genre. Yeah, I write mostly Gothic stories based off of fairy tales and folklore. And are you a plotter, pantser, or plancer? I do use the term discovery writer, not pantser. It's prettier. I like a prettier word. But I do think it's not so binary as it seems. I think everyone plots a little and everyone discovers a little bit. I call myself a discovery writer, but I do a tiny bit of outlining, just a smidge. I know how it ends. I never jump into a story without knowing what I'm leading up to, because like everything has to lead up to something. It has to all mean something here at the end. So you need, for me, I need to know what the end is when I start. It does not mean I know what twists and turns it's going to go through to get there. But I usually have kind of a concept of like the bones, but I don't write it down as an outline. I create a playlist because for me, the writing is more about the emotional journey than the plot. I don't generally have plot-driven stories. It's not about defeating the hero. It's about discovering something within the character, not defeating the hero. You're never going to have a story about defeating the hero. What am I talking about? It's not about defeating outside sources and figuring something out, although that can be part of it. It's always about the character's journey first. And a lot of times when I read a story, or I think it's more common in movies that doesn't have that character journey, it falls really flat.
Adventurous morning, camera went out. Okay. If there's a heavy plot and less character development, I'm not as interested in the story. So I prefer to focus on the character arc and music more than anything else. Kind of creates that like emotional guide for me to follow as I move the character through the story. So I would consider that very, very light, bare bones plotting. The real secret is that every book is a little different. Like that's my go-to method, but that doesn't mean every single book has been written in that exact method. Or every book moving forward will be written in that exact method, because sometimes I might have some ideas of things that are going to happen later, and I will just jot it down on a list. It's not set in stone. It's not necessarily going to be followed to the letter. Several things are going to be tweaked and ignored and added and taken out, but I will use it as a little bit of a guide. And I think it's not as much of a binary question as people make it out to be. It's always easier to talk about things in binary, but I think most writers do a little bit of plotting, a little bit of discovery writing, and it's gonna fluctuate more than they probably even realize from book to book. So I'm gonna clean up in the kitchen a little bit, and I will check back in with you later.
Yeah, Papa. Come on, let's go inside.
Who decided turning the oven on in this heat was a good idea? I don't know who that was. So yeah, I went out and did a couple of walks. took care of Bronte. Since I took so long to eat breakfast and it was lunchtime, I needed something more solid, so I'm going to hold off on eating the muffins right now. But I had a nice chili burger, which was delicious. Nothing says fall is finally here like chili. I mean, it's not, but it is. August is like pre-fall. We'll jump into a couple more of our questions. Are you self-published, trad published, or yet to be published? I really enjoy being in the indie space. I think there's something kind of punk rock about it. There's less pressure, so you can go at your own pace. And theoretically, there's more money, as in you do get a higher percentage of royalties. But of course, you don't have the big house backing you, so it's a give and take in that respect. But since authors are pretty much expected to do their own marketing and social media presence, regardless of whether or not they are trad pub or indie, I feel like indie just makes more sense. Might I potentially try trad pub at some point in my career? Maybe. I don't really know. It's not really a goal of mine or anything, but I like to try new things. But I really have a heart for indie publishing. I've enjoyed meeting other writers that are in that space. Like I said, it feels very punk rock, where it's like, nah, we're just regular people creating this piece of art and putting it out into the world. And it's not really about the sales, it's not about the prestige and whatever else that people associate with publishing a book. It's just about creating, and I love that. What AuthorTube related videos can we expect to find on your channel? A lot of writing vlogs. Primarily, it will be writing vlogs, and then a little bit more on the booktube side, like book reviews, reading vlogs, and maybe the occasional book analysis. But as far as AuthorTube goes, writing, a lot of writing vlogs. How many more questions do we have? We'll do one more. When did you start writing? And I grew up loving story, and I say loving story, not loving to read, because I couldn't read until I was 9. But before that, my mom would read me stories. I would play dress up. I would play, like, we had an elaborate mythology with our Barbie dolls where they all had their own unique personality and history. And when our friends came over, we would tell them that they were playing the dolls wrong and they needed to do it in the story world that we had already created for them. But when I was 13, my mom made me this little gazebo, I guess. She took lattice, like, and put it in like a little box up in our like hill garden. And she wanted to give me a quiet place to calm down because I had anxiety even that young all the time, and I would be freaked out, and she wanted to give me a place to like go and calm down and I guess mitigate meltdowns maybe. But when I was up there hanging out in my little space, I was like, well, what do I do while I'm up here? And I started writing a newsletter for the club, because I called it a clubhouse, and my sisters and some of the neighbor friends would hang out with me up there. And so I was like, I'm going to write a newsletter. Little did I know how that decision was going to change my life. At first, like, I would write just, oh, this is the things that happened in the Tyler world. Like, I think the first one had an article about how the Tylers just had pink eye. But very, very quickly, it turned into writing stories in serial. And my friends joined in, and we just all wrote our stories and published them. I think it started out like monthly, and it turned into weekly for a while, and then it went back to monthly. The newsletter had many iterations. I still have stacks of old newsletters. I don't think I have a copy of every single one, but we kept it going in different names, because it started out as Friendship Times, and I think it ended as Knights of the Page, into college. And that is where my love of writing really started, is just writing in a newsletter to share with my friends, and they would write their stories and share them with me, which is why, like, I just love crit group and like writing groups so much, because that's, to me, that's natural. Here's my stories, I want to hear your stories. And one day I might do a video where I kind of like look at some of the old stories and go through the newsletters and just kind of have a fun trip down memory lane. But what else am I going to do today? I still have a couple hours before my next round of walks. So I am going to go out and do some groundwork for getting a fall garden started. I was able to grow some flowers towards the beginning of the year, but the summer sun came and killed them, unfortunately. Part of me just wants to be discouraged by that and be like, well, I'm just not a good gardener. But I'm too stubborn for that. I'm going to go out there again and I'm going to start over and I'm going to learn from what I did wrong and we're going to have a fall garden. Yeah, so I'll go out and do just, I think today all I'm going to do is basically clean out the yard and get it ready for some other steps. Yeah, I'll come back after I do that. Maybe we'll try our muffin and talk some more. It is too hot for that kind of work right now. I always feel spoiled when I complain about the weather in California because it's always really mild. And honestly, this summer has been a really mild summer. It's only been hot the last maybe 2 weeks. But I got some gardening done, literally just groundwork. I just cleared the space, cleaned off the patio a little bit so that there is now a canvas with which to work on going into fall. I don't only have a literal garden, or trying to have a literal garden, but I also have what I've started calling my ink garden, which is essentially all the projects that I'm working on. And when I put time into them, I'm watering them. So I kind of wanted to give you an idea of what I'm planting in my ink garden this fall. Probably most notably, I am working on publishing Heart Splatters, which is a Gothic horror novella that tells the villain origin story of the villain from my novel Snow Roses. It asks the question of whether or not beauty is Lucille's only power and explores what she thinks she needs to do to survive. It's a complicated story because sometimes you root for her and sometimes you don't. And probably everyone's opinions on when to root for her and when not to is going to be a little bit different. And if that ends up being the case, I have written the story I intended to write. So I need to get that out this fall. Some other projects I'm working on, of course, is my D&D project, which is ongoing. We're going to get started playing again pretty soon, which I'm really excited about. We took a little bit of a break. So I play D&D every other Sunday with some friends, and I've been chronologizing the story as we play. And you can read the diary entries of my character, Kate, who is a gravedigger, no nonsense, very serious, who gets dragged into a very whimsical journey through the Feywild. And it's been a lot of fun to play her. So those are my two main ink plants this fall. But there are a couple of other smaller things that I will be working on. Probably a handful of new videos, new articles on Medium, and I'll be working on trying to train my dog Bronte. She's a very anxious dog because she's a COVID puppy. But since I've been doing so much work on my own anxiety this summer, I really want to help her work through some of her anxiety. And so I've been trying to learn how to do that for her. There's going to be a big study of Frankenstein this fall, which is going to be exciting. You'll have more details about that closer to November probably. But yeah, you might see some more cooking, a lot of more reading. But let's jump back into our questions. What is the first story you ever wrote? The first story I wrote was for the newsletter I talked about earlier, and it was a story called Two Kings, and it was the tale of two kings who were the best of friends, and they loved nothing better than to get together and brag. They would brag about this, they would brag about that, about their latest balls, about their latest tax levies. Well, one day, King George just happened to mention his army. Well, he told King James, I do believe that while your army is great, if they were to meet in battle, mine would win. And thus, thus begins the tale of two kings who start a war because they're bragging at each other. For a story written by a 13-year-old, it's not that bad. I don't think the novels I wrote at that time, because I wrote one about talking horses, will never see the light of day unless it's very, very heavily overhauled and published under a pen name. But the short story about two kings fighting for no reason was not that bad. It could be a good picture book, I think. What authors have inspired your writing the most? That's a rough one because there are my favorite authors and there are the authors whose style has actually worked its way into my writing, and they're not exactly the same thing. Like, I don't think my writing really resembles Terry Pratchett, but I adore everything he has ever written. But some of the authors that I do see, like, some of their style leaked into mine would be Robin McKinley. That's really when I fell in love with fairy tale retellings, was reading Robin McKinley. And Patricia McKillop, her prose style is phenomenal. Mine is not that good, but I do tend to do the same, like, poetic, wispy type of descriptions that I love so much. Robert Louis Stevenson, which might surprise some people. I think he is an undersung author for how engaging his adventures still are today. Yeah, he just writes these, like, straightforward blood and thunder adventures, and they grip you, and you're like, this is just a dude stranded on an island, but I need to know what happens next. And you can compare that to, like, Robinson Crusoe, and which is a little more on the boring side, a little more dry, but Robert Louis Stevenson is not dry for an author of his time. And then maybe some of the trashy work of Louisa May Alcott. I love her trashy stuff. The Gothic, I guess also Blood and Thunder's, like, short stories that she used to write. Plus, there was an unpublished book of hers called The Long and Fatal Love Chase, which I adore. Critics can say all they want about it. It is fun. And I found it more engaging than Little Women. And I read a autobiography on her once, and she did say that she got really tired of the Little Women's style of writing after that book got really popular, and then she wrote the second half of it, in which everyone wanted her to have Joe marry Laurie, and she very stubbornly did not have them get married. And she was really annoyed that everyone wanted to know who the little girls grew up to marry, as if that were the only important thing. I really admire Louisa May Alcott as an author. I think she wrote for money, which I'm not saying I necessarily admire her for that, but she was upfront about it. She wrote what paid, and sometimes she wrote the trashy, like, Penny Dreadful, Blood and Thunder type of short stories, and then sometimes she wrote the, like, proper, like, this is ladies having tea and being wholesome type of stories, which I've heard people say that she thought those were better, but I've also seen quotes where she said she doesn't really enjoy writing moralizing tales for young people, but that's what all her publishers wanted her to write. So I've heard it both ways. But she just wrote both. And they both sold well in different circles. And that was her goal, so she was okay with that. But I just admire, like, she took care of her family at a young age, and just in general, her perspective on life intrigues me. And I like that she thought it was annoying that everyone just wanted to know who Joe was going to marry, as if that were the only important thing that would happen to her as an adult. Do you schedule your writing, or just write whenever you can? Both. I write on a schedule when I can, but when I can't, I just find windows where I can. But I put everything in my schedule, so maybe that counts as scheduling. Even, we'll say I schedule my writing, but I schedule it whenever I can. We'll say that. What publishing company or printing company do you plan on using? So, when I first started publishing, I chose this very small company called Create Space to do my printing. I felt very cool about it. It was very indie, very hipster. And a year later, Amazon bought them. And I haven't switched away from Amazon yet because the only alternative that I'm really aware of is Ingram Spark. And I'm really intimidated because I've heard that their interface is difficult. And I'm bad with computers in general. So I'm scared of them. It doesn't mean I won't switch over eventually, but I haven't done it yet. But it's frustrating because I never chose Amazon. It wasn't a choice. I chose a different company, and that company was bought by Amazon. And now there are not as many alternatives as there used to be. So if you have any suggestions of what I could switch to, I would love to hear them. I would absolutely love to hear what other alternatives there are out there. I'm gonna go ahead and try my muffin real quick before we finish with these questions because I worked hard on this. And I'm curious if it came out okay. The texture seems fine. I have this iced peppermint tea to enjoy with it. I smeared some butter on here. Yeah, that's pretty good. It's supposed to be dense. I do think when I make this recipe again, if I use egg instead of egg substitute, I'll use 1 egg instead of the 2. But yeah, it came out pretty good. I'm looking forward to eating these for breakfast for the next 2 weeks or so. I popped the rest of them in my freezer so that they'll last and I'll not have to do much cooking for the next couple of weeks. So we'll finish up these questions real quick and then I've got to get going to my next walk. Do you use a typewriter, computer, write by hand, or a blend? I usually write by hand the first draft. It just feels cozier. It feels easier to get into like the flow state for that first creation draft. And I like the feeling of a pen in my hand and the way the ink flows on the paper. So first draft, handwritten. Obviously it can't stay handwritten for subsequent drafts. I have to put it into a computer. I start out handwritten and then move it to a computer. But I'm just going to say that can change from story to story. There was one story I wrote, this was a long time ago before I had really refined my process, but I wanted it to feel real like businessy, real like, I don't know if I want to give away the premise in case I pull it out again one day, but I wanted it to feel real like businessy and a little bit maybe film noir. And so I did type it completely on the computer to begin with because I wanted to have that typey feeling while I was writing it so that it would leak into the manuscript, which I think worked a little bit. Probably was more in my head than anything else, but that's the point of writing. It is in your head and you got to pull it out. So usually type out by hand, type it up, or write it out by hand first, then when I redraft, I'll type it out. But that is subject to change if the story tells me it wants to be written in a different way, just like my outlining process can change if the story says, no, write me this way. Who am I to argue? I'm going to do what the story tells me to. What are you most looking forward to now that you're part of AuthorTube? Getting to know other authors. I love story. I love my stories. I love your stories. I love any stories. So I'm looking forward to getting to know more about some other authors and connecting with them and hearing what they have to write about. So that's it for the author newbie tag. And I am going to go out and do some more walks. So this will be the last you'll see me of the day. I'm going to go ahead and end this vlog here. Thank you so much for joining me for this cozy little project day. We did some gardening, we did some baking, we talked about writing. Lovely, lovely. And please come and say hi. Tell me what you're working on and what you wish AuthorTube had more of.
Thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing to Ink Spills if you enjoy fairy tales, Gothic literature, poetry, book recommendations, or writing.